The gavel slammed like a gunshot through the stale community center air. Karen Mitchell, draped in her signature HOA pearls like she was royalty at a damn coronation, practically leapt over the polished table. "This is fraud," she screeched, voice rising like steam off asphalt. Her face twisted with the kind of rage only people drunk on power could summon. Beside me, calm as a sunset, stood the sheriff's deputy holding a fat stack of eviction notices bearing each of their names. "Yep, that's me. You're probably wondering how a rancher with dust on his boots and 1,000 head of cattle to his name ended up standing in the center of a suburban courtroom, legally evicting an entire HOA from their own cookie-cutter kingdom. Let me take you back. Let me take you to the day the ground shifted under my boots, not from an earthquake, but from betrayal, bureaucracy, and a lie with a postage stamp on it. The sun had just crested over the southern hills, slicing golden light across the rugged spine of my family's 150-acre ranch. It was the kind of morning only people born on the land understand: crisp air, the scent of mesquite, and the quiet murmur of cattle content in the distance. I was checking the water lines out past the lower pasture, the ground still cool from the night. The same routine I'd done every morning since I was 12, back when my granddad used to wake me with a slap on the boot and a thermos of black coffee I wasn't old enough to appreciate. That's when I saw the blue blur of Jim's truck coming up the dirt road, tires kicking up dust like ghosts. Jim had been our postman for decades, slower than a snake in January, but reliable. The kind of man who still tipped his hat and used your first name like it mattered. Only this time, he didn't smile when he stepped out. He held the envelope out at arm's length, like it was ticking. I wiped my hands on my jeans, took it, gave him a nod. "Thanks, Jim." He hesitated, shifted on his boots, looked like he wanted to say something, but all he did was tip his hat and drive off without another word. I should have known then, but I didn't. Not yet. I tore it open right there in the field. The paper stiff and too white under the sun. Legal language. Foreclosure notice. Something about unpaid maintenance fees. A court-ordered auction. I read it twice. Then a third time. Slower. Hoping I'd misunderstood. I hadn't. My heart began to pound. You know the feeling when something sinks in your gut so heavy it feels like the world's turning sideways. That was me. Knees weak. Blood roaring in my ears like a freight train. They were saying my ranch had been seized and sold by the Willow Bend Homeowners Association. Sold? To developers. For pennies. I staggered backward. The ground suddenly unfamiliar under my boots. The sun felt too close, like it was burning holes through my hat. My throat dried to sand. I'd never even heard of Willow Bend sending notices out here. Hell, I didn't even live inside any HOA boundaries. My great-grandfather carved this land out of nothing but stubbornness and sweat back in 1910, long before any of those beige suburbs even existed. The ranch wasn't part of any community improvement district. We were the land before they were the map. And maintenance fees. For what the sky, I left the cattle right there, watered but restless, and climbed into my old pickup. The tires spat gravel as I tore down the county road, past the old gas station, past the diner where Miss Jolene still served pie thicker than your hand. I didn't stop. I couldn't. The town records office was a squat brick building, as dull and bland as the men who worked in it. I stormed in like a dust devil in denim, slammed the letter down on the counter. Daniel, the twitchy little clerk with glasses too big for his face, blinked up at me. "There's got to be some mistake," I said, my voice low but trembling. Rage doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers, tight and dangerous. He typed, clicked, bit his lip, then rotated the monitor toward me with a hand that trembled just enough for me to notice. There it was, plain as day. A special annexation filed 6 months ago by the Willow Bend HOA. According to that line of digital poison, my property now belonged to their district, and that, according to their logic, meant they could bill me. And when I didn't pay because those damn notices had been sent to an address I'd never seen before, maybe on purpose, they slapped a lien on the land, foreclosed, and sold it at a private auction attended only by their cronies. I stared at that screen so hard I thought it might catch fire. The names of the buyers glared back like vultures at a wake. Karen Mitchell, Todd Granger, half the board. They'd carved up the ranch like it was nothing more than a subdivision waiting to happen. They hadn't just taken land, they'd taken my bloodline. I demanded every document. Daniel printed them out with trembling fingers, page after page, each one a fresh wound. There were forged signatures on the annexation petition. The county commissioner who approved it, Karen Mitchell's brother-in-law. Of course. And it hit me like a branding iron to the chest. This wasn't incompetence. This was theft. Deliberate. Coordinated. They'd seen my land, my stubborn old ranch standing like a middle finger to their manicured world, and decided they wanted it, so they took it. Not with guns, with printers and petty rules, with shadows and smiles and signatures that never touched a real hand. I drove home that night in silence. Not even the radio, just the sound of my tires on dirt and the storm rising inside me. The ranch stood waiting, golden in the last light, unaware it had been betrayed on paper. The porch swing creaked gently in the breeze, like an old soldier trying not to cry. I sat on the tailgate, foreclosure letter in one fist, and stared across the fields where my grandfather once taught me how to rope, where my mother once hung sheets in the wind, where I buried my bone under the cottonwood tree. This ain't over, I whispered to the sky, because how do you fight back against a lie written in ink? How do you tear down a system built to protect thieves in cardigans? How do you reclaim something they said you lost but never really gave? You ever been stolen from, not just robbed, but erased? Ever watched your legacy get shredded by someone who's never had dirt under their fingernails, who's never stood in a storm and prayed for rain? Tell me if you were in my boots. Where would you start? Because me, I started by swearing a vow and the land. The land was listening. The next morning, the ranch was quiet, too quiet, the kind of stillness that makes you think something's watching you. Even when you can't see it, the cattle milled near the southern fence line, tails flicking at flies, chewing like nothing had happened, like the world hadn't tilted on its axis the day before. But I had changed. I was different now. And when a man like me changes, the land changes with him. I didn't waste time. By 6 a.m., I was back at the town records office, not to argue this time, but to hunt. Daniel, the clerk, flinched when he saw me walk in, and for a second, I thought he might run. I didn't blame him. I wasn't there for vengeance, not yet, but I needed every thread in the web these snakes had spun. Daniel, I said, setting down my thermos on the counter with a metallic thud. I want every document ever filed by Willowbend HOA in the last 5 years, every annexation, every map, every signature, and every name connected to it. He blinked, adjusted his glasses, and opened his mouth to protest. But I cut him off with a look that told him I wasn't asking. He printed, I waited, I read, and the deeper I dug, the clearer the pattern became. They'd done this before, not just to me. 3 years ago, a single mother named Teresa James lost her 5-acre homestead on the north end of the county. Same HOA, same commissioner, same annexation paperwork. Her property got turned into a jogging trail that no one jogged. Then there was the retired Army vet, Mr. Mike Collins, who used to run a small goat dairy until suddenly the HOA decided his fencing violated community standards, even though he'd lived there since the Korean War. They buried him in code violations until he gave up and moved into a trailer park. Karen Mitchell and her board hadn't just stolen land, they'd made it a business. And nobody had stopped them because nobody fought back the way I was about to. By midday, I had a binder thick as a Bible and twice as angry. I needed help. Not the kind you find online or in some office with suits who'd never seen a cow up close. I needed someone who knew old land law, someone who understood covenants, reversionary rights, and the ways paper could be turned into poison if you weren't watching. I drove 2 counties over to the law office of Harlan Price, the man who'd handled my grandfather's estate, who still wore suspenders like it was 1954 and rolled his own cigarettes without ever lighting them. Harlan didn't say much when I laid out the problem, just chewed his toothpick a little harder and motioned for his paralegal to bring it in the big box. The big box was an archive so old the lid crackled when he opened it. Deeds, land grants, boundary surveys from back when half the town still thought telegraphs were cutting-edge technology. We spent hours cross-referencing maps, checking parcel numbers, and decoding legal jargon written in the kind of cursive they don't teach anymore. It was late afternoon when Jenny Harlan's paralegal let out a small gasp. "I think I found something." She pointed to a worn, leather-bound volume. Inside was the original land covenant from 1910. Not a copy, not a summary, the real thing, signed by my great-grandfather in ink, so faded it looked like smoke, buried in the clause, right beneath his signature. Was a condition no part of this land may be subdivided or sold without express written consent of a direct descendant. If done so, the deed shall revert to the family line. Reversionary clause? A legal boomerang. The land wasn't just mine because I lived on it. It was mine because it always returned to us like a river remembering its course after a storm. Harlan leaned back, eyes narrow. If this clause holds, then the HOA didn't just commit fraud. Son, they built an empire on a foundation of sand. I didn't smile, not yet, because this wasn't over. This was just proof I had a weapon. Now I needed a strategy. We spent the next week building a legal fortress. Harlan filed immediate injunctions on every parcel of land sold off by the HOA that had once belonged to my ranch. We flagged them for title review. Jenny sent quiet letters to every title company in the region, warning them of potential reversions. No drama, no noise, just legal slow-burn revenge. Meanwhile, I started digging into Karen Mitchell herself. You see, a tyrant never builds an empire alone. They surround themselves with people who owe them favors, silence, or protection. Karen had 3 board members under her thumb: Todd Granger, a real estate broker who'd flipped half the homes in Willow Bend; Susan Elridge, a former zoning officer turned compliance director; and Fred Barker, who ran the HOA's legal affairs like a backroom poker game. What they didn't know was that I was already inside. I started making friends. Not fake handshakes at town mixers, but real connections: lawn guys, plumbers, delivery drivers, even the woman who walked dogs through Willow Bend every morning. People who saw things, people who heard whispers. I learned that Karen had recently renovated her kitchen using discretionary improvement funds meant for road maintenance, that Todd had been selling properties to shell companies he quietly controlled, which then leased them back to residents at inflated rates, and that Susan had been denying solar panel permits in exchange for personal gifts from gas companies. Corruption, top to bottom. But I kept quiet, because sometimes silence is louder than a scream. I bought a burner phone, created a new email address, and started posing as a prospective buyer from out of state. I inquired about HOA properties, sent messages to Todd's brokerage, scheduled fake showings, collected responses, patterns. What I needed was timing. They were planning a new development, a luxury expansion built directly on the southern pastures that had once watered my grandfather's cattle, the same pastures now owned, on paper, by a dozen HOA board affiliates under LLCs they'd created just weeks before. But there was one problem they didn't account for: water rights. And guess who still held the original well deeds? Me. They hadn't found those because they were handwritten in a box of family Bibles under my grandmother's bed. They'd bought dry land, and now they were panicking. Karen's emails, which Jenny got access to through a whistleblower, showed desperation, talks of leveraging influence, calling in favors, and even neutralizing nuisance claims. I was the nuisance, but I wasn't alone anymore. Neighbors started calling, people who hated the HOA but had been too afraid to speak, a retired school teacher whose fence had been cited for non-uniform picket spacing, a young couple fined $600 for having unapproved Christmas lights, a veteran whose flagpole had been forcibly removed because it was not in harmony with surrounding aesthetics. Each story was a match, and I was building a fire. I organized a quiet coalition: homeowners, ex-members, victims. We didn't shout. We filed complaints, affidavits, audits. Within 2 months, state regulators started circling. IRS agents began sniffing into HOA tax filings. And the county treasurer, who once ignored my calls, suddenly asked to meet for coffee, The walls were cracking. Karen sensed it. At the next HOA meeting, she tried to rally the board with patriotic speeches and vague threats about outsiders trying to destroy everything we've built. She even staged a charity event to clean up the community image. I attended, wearing boots caked in the same dirt she thought she'd buried me under. I shook her hand, smiled, said nothing. Because revenge isn't a bullet, it's a seed, and mine was growing. They say power corrupts, but I think it reveals. And what Karen Mitchell didn't understand, what she never could understand, was that when you steal from a man who knows the value of land, not just in dollars, but in blood, sweat, and memory, you don't just provoke a lawsuit, you provoke a legacy, and this legacy was just getting started. By the time the first frost rolled over the ranch that fall, I was already 10 steps ahead of Karen Mitchell and her HOA Council of Crooks. I woke before dawn every morning. Not to mend fences or check cattle like I used to, but to sit at my kitchen table surrounded by file boxes, maps, affidavits, and legal briefs, sipping black coffee while plotting the slow dismantling of their empire. But let me be clear, this wasn't just about the land anymore. It had evolved. It had become a war for memory, for dignity, for every quiet soul they'd bulldozed, fined, embarrassed, or erased with the stroke of a pen, and they didn't even see it coming. After confirming the reversionary clause in my great-grandfather's covenant, the one that legally bound every subdivided acre back to our bloodline, Harlan and I shifted gears, quietly, surgically. We weren't fighting in court yet, not directly. No, that came later. First, we needed to trap them in their own paperwork. We needed leverage, and leverage in HOA politics, lives in the shadows meeting minutes, budget reports, fake landscaping bids, bogus code enforcement fines. So we hunted shadows. Jenny, sharp as barbed wire and twice as tough, embedded herself into the HOA ecosystem like a ghost. She posed as a first-time buyer looking to join the community. She attended meetings, brought cookies to luncheons, even charmed her way into a short-term lease on one of the HOA-controlled rentals so she could get access to internal documents. She was ruthless in the best way, smiling while she gutted their entire record system from the inside out. One night, she called me from her car, barely able to contain the thrill in her voice. "They've been double booking repair contracts," she said, her breath fogging up the windshield, charging the HOA twice for the same roof repairs, and funneling the overages into a dummy maintenance fund. How much, I asked? Try 400 grand over 3 years. That was just the tip. As we peeled back layer after layer, the full extent of the corruption began to show itself like a snake shedding its skin. Landscaping bills paid to non-existent companies, road repaving jobs never completed, legal consulting fees paid to Fred Barker's cousin's law firm, which didn't even have a real address. Karen had created a kingdom, all right, but not one of order and beauty. It was rot disguised as regulation. But I needed more than dirt. I needed power, the kind of power they respected. So I built it over the next 8 months. I quietly acquired 32 homes inside Willow Bend, each one purchased through a different LLC, each one scrubbed clean of any link to me. Some I bought at foreclosure auctions, some through brokers, some directly from fed-up owners who were one citation away from losing their minds. I didn't overpay. I just paid fast. Quiet, no questions asked, no red flag. I let them think it was a sign of prosperity, a new wave of young, engaged investors who would bring life back to the neighborhood. Karen even sent out a newsletter welcoming the next generation of community leadership. I laughed so hard I nearly spilled my whiskey. The truth, every house I bought was a vote, and I was building a supermajority. See, most folks don't realize that in many HOAs, decisions, even massive ones, like electing the board or rewriting bylaws, come down to votes from the property owners. You control the homes. You control the vote. You control the vote. You control the future. And I wasn't just buying properties. I was buying their silence, their rules, their illusion of control. By the time spring thawed the last of the creek ice, my LLCs owned just over 52% of Willow Bend's residential lots. That's when I called the first special meeting. According to their own bylaws, the ones Karen had weaponized against people for years, any stakeholder with majority ownership could call an emergency session and submit motions to amend regulations. No board approval required. No notice period. I drafted a letter, had it notarized, delivered it by courier to the HOA office, same one where they'd once signed away my ranch like it was clearance land. Then I waited. The meeting was set for a Tuesday night. Karen strutted into that conference room in her usual pastel blazer, pearls polished, lips curled into that country club smile she reserved for moments she thought she'd already won. Todd Granger flanked her, still reeking of cheap cologne and condescension. Susan looked nervous, her eyes darting across the room like she could smell the shift in the wind. They didn't recognize the trap. Not until I stood, not until I said, "Before we begin, I'd like the record to reflect that I am the authorized representative of the following LLCs: Prairie Ventures, Redstone Holdings, Oaklight Group." I listed every single entity, each one tied to a deed, each one counted as a vote. Karen's face went pale. I continued. As per your bylaws, I am representing a voting block of 52.3% of total residential ownership within Willowbend. That gives me quorum control. Effective immediately. The silence that followed delicious. Todd opened his mouth to protest, but I slid a copy of their own rules across the table, highlighted, annotated, dated, and backed by legal review. Susan tried to object on the grounds of community spirit, which might have meant something in a Jane Austen novel but didn't hold up in court. I introduced a motion, effective immediately. All enforcement activities by the Willowbend HOA are suspended pending third-party audit, passed. Then a second motion, a forensic financial investigation into the HOA's past 5 years of spending, contracting, and fee assessments, passed. And then the final nail, a recall election for the entire board with nominations open to any property owner in good standing. They knew it was over. Not that night, not technically. There would still be legal scrambling, denial, manipulation rats trying to claw their way back onto a sinking ship. But the tide had turned. The castle gates were open. The villagers had torches. They just needed someone to show them where to aim. Over the next 2 weeks, word spread. Residents who'd once been too afraid to speak now lined up to vote. Retirees, young families, veterans, immigrants, renters turned buyers, all fed up with Karen's petty tyranny. They showed up with documents, receipts, stories. They came angry, but focused, unified. By month's end, the board was out, unanimously removed. Karen refused to leave, claimed it was illegitimate, un-American, unconstitutional. She even called a local news station, tried to spin herself as the victim of a rural intimidation campaign, but the footage didn't help her, especially the part where she shrieked at a teenage volunteer and slapped a campaign sign off someone's lawn. She became a meme by morning. Todd resigned quietly. Susan vanished altogether. Fred tried to hang on, citing legal precedent no one could find or verify. Harlan sent him a cease and desist wrapped in a lawsuit. He backed down, and just like that, the HOA fell. But I wasn't finished, because this wasn't about taking over. It was about making right. I proposed a final motion to the new interim committee made up of real residents. Honest ones, teachers, nurses, retirees who knew how to balance a checkbook and didn't give a damn about Christmas light regulations. Dissolve the Willowbend Homeowners Association, not just suspend it, kill it, dead. The vote, unanimous. And when the paperwork was filed and the dissolution certified by the state, I drove out to the edge of town, to the sign that used to read Willowbend, a covenant community. And I tore it out with my bare hands, not out of anger, out of mercy, because some things deserve to be forgotten. But some things, like the land, and those who honor it, deserve to be remembered forever. The wind shifted the morning after the HOA dissolution was certified. I don't mean that metaphorically, though. God knows the metaphor was perfect. I mean the actual wind. It blew cold from the west, cutting sharp across the hills like a warning. A reckoning was coming. And it wasn't just for Karen Mitchell. It was for everyone who profited from the lie, because the HOA, for all its power and arrogance, was just the mask. The real rot ran deeper: developers, lenders, contractors, real estate agents, even county officials, all of them complicit. All of them believing they could rewrite the rules of ownership because they had lawyers, lobbyists, and time on their side. But I had something stronger. I had land, I had law, and I had patience. You see, this whole thing had never been about theatrics, the courtroom showdown, the recall election. Those were just brush clearing. What I wanted, what I'd needed, was to set a precedent that would gut the cancer at its source. A kill shot delivered not in anger, but with precision. And now that I had control of Willowbend, I could make the next move. It started quietly, the way most dangerous things do. I assembled a private team, not lawyers this time, but forensic accountants and old-timers with surveying experience. I wanted every inch of Willowbend mapped, not just physically, but legally. Title chains, easement rights, utility line disputes, parcel boundary overlaps, and most importantly, breaches of the 1910 covenant. That document, faded and fragile as it was, held more power than any modern title insurance policy because it wasn't written for bureaucrats, it was written for blood. And what we found was staggering. Out of 142 homes in the original Willowbend development, 118 were built on land that was either improperly annexed, fraudulently subdivided, or traced back to forged approvals that violated the reversionary clause, which meant they didn't legally exist, not as owned dwellings. Anyway, not under the law. Now, I could have gone scorched earth then and there, served eviction notices, froze mortgages, called in the courts and watched the panic unfold. But I didn't, because the people living in those homes, most of them were victims too. Middle-class families, retirees, blue-collar folks who had no idea they were squatting on stolen ground. They'd been lied to, just like I had. So I did something Karen Mitchell never would have considered. I showed up, in person, door to door. I wore my work shirt and scuffed boots and told them the truth, not the legal jargon, the truth. I told them how their homes had been built on stolen legacy, how their deeds were voidable, their HOA fees were illegal, and their security was based on forged documents signed in the shadows. And then I did something that nearly made a few of them cry. I offered them a deal, a real one. They could stay, every single one of them. No forced sales, no lawsuits, no evictions. I'd draft a new lease, one that honored the land, respected the past, and gave them actual protection. They'd become tenants of Freedom Fields, under a charter built on consent, not coercion. They could buy the land outright later, once the titles were cleared, or they could rent at fair market rates until they were ready. Some called it insane, others called it justice. I didn't call it anything. I just signed the papers and moved to the next house. It took 3 months. But by the end of that winter, 1987, homeowners had accepted to the offer. Not because they were forced, because it was fair, because it was the first time anyone had treated them like neighbors instead of assets. But not everyone saw it that way. A group of holdouts led, unsurprisingly, by Todd Granger, decided to fight back. Todd had managed to hold on to 6 properties through backdoor sales and straw owners. He refused to acknowledge the covenant, claimed adverse possession, and tried to challenge the court ruling on the HOA's invalidity. It was a bold move, and it was stupid, because Todd had left a digital paper trail a mile long, fake LLCs, sham transfers, under-the-table agreements with the former zoning officer. Jenny unearthed it all and handed it over to the state attorney general in a box labeled Todd's Tower of Lies. A month later, Todd was indicted for real estate fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy to obstruct land title investigation. His mugshot made the front page of the county ledger, just under the headline, "Local Developer Built Homes on Stolen Dirt." I saved a copy, framed it, hung it in the ranch outhouse. But even with Todd out of the picture, there were still ghosts to deal with: lawsuits pending, insurance companies balking, banks trying to deny loan forgiveness on properties that technically didn't exist. So I went one step further. I opened the books. Freedom Fields wasn't just a clever name. It became an actual charter, a land trust built around the original covenant. Each resident, each tenant, each family who agreed to the new terms became part of it. Not as property owners, but as stewards. They weren't just buying homes, they were investing in history. We used the old community center as our headquarters, the same building where Karen once held her empire of petty fines and parking violations. We gutted it, ripped out the fake marble columns and the HOA bulletin boards, replaced it with wooden beams, handmade benches, and a long table carved from a fallen oak out by the creek. That table became our town hall. We met every month, not to enforce rules, but to share ideas, real ones. A free seed library, a volunteer mechanic co-op, a shared livestock program for kids who wanted to learn how to raise animals without leaving the neighborhood. It wasn't just a subdivision anymore. It was becoming a community. The land responded. 2. Pastures that had gone dry under synthetic turf began to grow again. Wildflowers bloomed along the southern trails. Kids rode bikes where Karen once wanted to build a luxury spa. The creek, once neglected and rerouted by developers, found its way back to its natural bed. But the most unexpected change was in me. For years, I'd lived like a sentinel guarding the ranch, distrusting everyone, convinced the world beyond the fence line wanted only to take. And I wasn't wrong, but I also wasn't right. Because when I stopped fighting alone and started rebuilding with people who listened, who gave, who worked with their hands and hearts, the land healed. And so did I. One evening, standing on the ridge where I used to watch the sunset in silence, I looked down over the town, not the HOA, not the battlefield, the town. Lights twinkled from porches once held under tyrannical regulation. Flags waved. Gardens bloomed. Voices carried on the wind laughter. Not anger, hope, not bitterness. And for the first time since this all began, I didn't feel like I had something to prove. I felt like I'd already proven it. That land doesn't belong to those who buy it cheap and flip it fast. It belongs to those who remember it, who work it, defend it, love it. So I carved a new sign that night, not one to hang above a gate or a driveway, but to plant in the ground, deep and permanent. Freedom Field's land of the remembered, because they tried to erase us. But the land remembered. And now, so would everyone else. The day I walked into the county courthouse to file the last batch of title reversions, there was a strange calm in the air. Not the kind that warns of storms, no. This was different. This was the stillness of a reckoning finally coming to rest. The silence right before the dust begins to settle and people start counting what they've gained or lost. The clerk behind the glass pane, a new kid barely old enough to rent a car, watched me shuffle through forms and deeds with wide eyes like I was carrying live ammo instead of legal documents. I guess in a way, I slid the final set across the counter, each one stamped, signed, and notarized. These weren't just pieces of paper. They were proof that every inch of Freedom Fields from the southern pastures to the northern ridgeline was now fully, irrevocably under my stewardship again. Not just morally, not just historically, but legally, by court order, by charter, by blood. It had taken nearly a year of battles in courtrooms, in county meetings, in the silent stares of neighbors unsure whether I was savior or tyrant. But the line was clear now. The HOA was dead. The developers who bought up pieces of my ranch were gone. Their plans for country clubs and gated spas buried under audit investigations and reversion clauses. And those who stayed, they were tenants, community members, or in the process of becoming co-owners under the Freedom Fields Trust. But there was still one name I hadn't crossed off my list, Karen Mitchell. I hadn't seen her since the board was dissolved. After her public meltdown and the failed lawsuits, she'd gone underground, moved in with a sister in the next town over. If the whispers were true, but that didn't mean she was gone. Karen was the kind of weed that grows back if you don't rip it out by the roots. And sure enough, just when I thought she'd withered away, a letter arrived, not from her directly. Of course, that would have been too honest. It came from a boutique law firm in the city, printed on thick, embossed paper, as if fancy stationery could hide the desperation behind the ink. They were challenging the eviction ruling against Karen's property. claiming procedural violations, lack of due process, and my personal favorite, an emotional distress caused by hostile restructuring. It was pure Karen Petty, self-righteous, and legally hollow. But she had money, or at least she had money, once, and she was going to use what was left of it to drag this out. So I prepared. I met with Harlan that same afternoon, handed him the letter, and waited while he read it in full silence. When he finally looked up, he let out a short laugh, the kind of noise you make when something's so stupid it's almost impressive. "Let her try," he said, tapping the paper. "This isn't about legality, it's about legacy. And she's already lost both. Still, we couldn't underestimate her. So we filed a counter motion not just to block her appeal, but to seek damages for intentional delay, harassment, and obstruction of justice. I attached a personal statement to the filing. Not one written by lawyers, but by me, in my own words, about what she did to my family's land, about the forged annexation, the laws, the auction, the cattle pens they paved over. The judge accepted it into the record without hesitation. But what happened next? That was something even I didn't expect. A reporter, not from the local rag that once printed HOA press releases like gospel. No. This one was from the Western Ledger, a statewide paper with real reach. He showed up at the edge of the ranch, boots dusty, notebook in hand, asking if I'd be willing to talk. At first, I almost told him to take a hike. I didn't do this for headlines. I did it because it was right, because the land needed a voice when paper tried to speak louder than truth. But something about the kid, maybe the sincerity in his voice, or the way he didn't flinch at the smell of cow dung, made me pause. So I agreed. We sat on the porch. I told him everything. Not just the legal play-by-play, but the real story. The early mornings, the cold coffee, the nights I spent staring at foreclosure papers with shaking hands. The first time I realized I wasn't alone, the people who joined me, the ones who left, the ones who tried to stop me. He listened, took notes, didn't interrupt. And when the story ran, the rancher who took back a town, it exploded. Suddenly, Freedom Fields wasn't just a local headline. It was a symbol of pushback, of the little guy saying no more, of how a rancher with mud on his boots and an old covenant in a fireproof box could beat a system built to erase him. We started getting letters from Arizona, from Texas, from Colorado, other ranchers, homeowners, people swallowed by HOA hellholes, or trapped in land grabs orchestrated by developers who saw open space as a blank check. They wanted to know how I did it, what the secret was, how to fight back. So I wrote it down, not a manifesto, not a legal guide, just a story of how I lost everything and how I took it back. We printed copies through a local press, sold them at feed stores and farmers markets. All proceeds went to a new legal fund we created to help rural landowners fight fraudulent annexations and HOA overreach. Jenny volunteered to run the admin. Harlan agreed to review at least 3 new cases a month. We weren't just building fences anymore. We were building armor. And Karen, she kept pushing. Filed another appeal, changed lawyers, went on a local radio show to paint herself as the martyr of suburban order, claimed I was turning the community into a backwater, free-for-all. I didn't respond, because you don't argue with ghosts, you bury them. It took 6 more weeks. But the judge issued a final ruling denying Karen's appeal with prejudice and ordering her to vacate the property within 30 days or face forced eviction by county sheriff. She tried to file for bankruptcy. It got thrown out when they discovered she'd transferred assets to a cousin in Utah. On the day of her eviction, I didn't show up. I stayed at the ranch, watched the sun rise over the eastern hills while deputies loaded her belongings into a moving truck. Later, someone dropped off a photo of her standing at the edge of her lawn, arms crossed, mouth tight, watching as the world she built crumbled around her. I didn't smile, but I didn't mourn either. Some losses are necessary. Some endings are earned. Later that month, we held a community gathering, not a meeting, a celebration. Kids ran through the fields. Neighbors shared homemade pies and smoked brisket. We unveiled a new marker at the edge of town carved by a local craftsman, funded by the trust. It read, "Freedom Fields, founded by honor, restored by truth." And beneath that, in smaller letters, a quote from my great-grandfather's journal: "What's earned in dust can't be taken by ink." The wind stirred again that evening, warm this time, hopeful, and as I stood at the edge of the crowd, the firelight flickering across the open land that had once been stolen, I realized something I hadn't said out loud until that moment. We didn't just win, we changed the rules. And somewhere, deep in the soil, I swear the land was whispering back. The morning after Karen's final eviction, the town felt different. Not quieter, not louder, just lighter. Like something heavy had finally been pried off its chest. The air over Freedom Fields had a kind of snap to it, the way it does after a storm, fresh, still, and charged with the kind of energy that makes the hair on your arms stand up. The kind of energy that says, now what? I didn't answer that question right away. After 2 years of legal brawls, late night strategizing, and watching every handshake for hidden knives, I needed time, not to rest, ranchers don't rest, but to breathe. To recalibrate. The war was over, but a war leaves rubble, even when you win. I walked the fence line that day the full stretch, from the outer ridge near the old mineral wastes to the southern bluff where my granddad's windmill still creaked in the breeze. It took me nearly 5 hours. Not counting the time, I stopped by the creek to check the runoff and to think. I hadn't stood in that spot since before it was Willowbend. Before synthetic turf and plastic fountains. Before developers started slicing the land into parcels like it was just inventory on a spreadsheet. Now, the wind moved like it remembered me, like it knew the balance had been reset. But even as the land settled, my phone didn't stop ringing. Not from lawyers or HOA remnants, those ghosts had been exorcised. No, these calls were from other people now. Strangers, farmers from Kansas who'd lost easement rights, retirees in Nevada getting fined for patriotic mailbox paint, a young black couple in Georgia whose HOA president had declared their raised garden beds unsightly. They'd read the story, or heard it secondhand, or seen the local news clips go viral when Karen Mitchell's eviction became something of an internet legend. They weren't calling to congratulate me. They were calling for help. At first, I didn't know what to tell them. I wasn't a lawyer. I wasn't a politician. I was just a man who'd gotten lucky with a 100-year-old covenant and a team of stubborn old-timers who knew how to read maps and sniff out fraud. But that, right there, was the point. It wasn't luck. It was resolve. And resolve can be taught. So I called a meeting, not a community potluck or a Freedom Fields barbecue. Those were happening on their own now. No invitation needed. This was different. I called together the people who'd helped me win Harlan. Jenny, a few new neighbors who had come to trust the process, and I laid out an idea, a foundation, not symbolic, real. We'd call it the Land Remember Room, a nonprofit dedicated to helping homeowners and land stewards fight against unlawful HOA abuse, fraudulent annexation, and unjust land seizure. Not a political group, not a think tank, a boots-on-the-ground support network for people like me. Jenny loved it. Harlan agreed to sit on the board. A local software engineer offered to build a website for free. Within a month, we had a hotline, a donation pool, and a legal database indexed with hundreds of template motions, example clauses, and annotated documents. We weren't offering miracles, just tools. The same ones I'd used, the same ones no one had handed me when I needed them most. Meanwhile, Freedom Fields continued to grow. Not in size, we weren't expanding. And I made damn sure of that. No, it grew in spirit. Kids were building tree houses now without needing to submit architectural sketches. Veterans were raising flags on tall, proud poles without worrying about aesthetic compliance. Front porches glowed with yellow, teal, rust-red colors long forbidden by Karen's beige crusade. And then came the questions, from towns nearby, then counties, then news outlets. Could Freedom Fields be replicated? Could a suburban community model itself on land trust principles, collective stewardship, and voluntary codes? Could a place function without an HOA? I answered them the same way every time. You don't need to destroy something to build something better, but you do have to stop pretending. Comfort is the same thing as freedom. Most got it, some didn't. One reporter from a national real estate publication accused me of trying to romanticize frontier law in modern suburbia. I invited him to come muck stalls for a week. He never responded. Still, not everyone welcomed what we were doing. I got a few anonymous letters in the mail. One told me I was setting back community standards by 50 years. Another warned that Freedom Fields would become a lawless enclave if we didn't install proper codes and mandatory dues. They were signed concerned citizens. I threw them in the fireplace. Because the truth is, we weren't lawless. We had more order now than we ever did under the HOA. But it was organic order. It came from neighbors talking to neighbors, from respect, not regulation. Take the Elmwood fire, for example. Late spring, just before the rainy season hit, a small electrical blaze sparked behind one of the older homes near the northern fence line. No one heard the smoke alarm. The family was out. But their neighbor, an old Army medic named Russell, smelled it from his porch, grabbed a garden hose, and was on the roof dousing embers before the fire truck even left the station. No citations, no emergency procedure forms, just human instinct. We rebuilt that roof together. Took 2 weekends and 4 cases of beer. That's how things got done now. Not mandated, volunteered, and that culture bled into everything. One Sunday morning, a little girl named Kayla came knocking on my front door with a jar of quarters and a hand-drawn flyer. She wanted to start a Freedom Fields animal shelter fund after seeing a stray dog limping near the trailhead. We set her up in the old tool shed next to the community barn. 2 weeks later, she had 12 volunteers, 3 kennels, and a visiting vet from the next county over. No forms, no signatures, just action. Meanwhile, across the state, other neighborhoods started sending emissaries, not officials, just folks, curious ones, wanting to know how we managed it, what we did different, why it worked. I didn't give them PowerPoints. I gave them coffee, walked them through the pasture, let them talk to people who used to be afraid to put up wind chimes without HOA approval. And little by little, the idea started catching on. We got calls from South Dakota, Montana, even parts of Florida where retirees were tired of paying $200 fines for the wrong kind of flower pot. They didn't all become Freedom Fields. They didn't have to, but they took the spirit of it. They started remembering that land doesn't need fences to feel secure. It needs people who give a damn. And while the rest of the world rushed to digitize, monetize, and flatten every inch of wildness left, we were planting new trees, building coops, teaching kids how to use a hammer without YouTube, because the land doesn't forget, and we were living proof of that. One night, months after the foundation launched and the last fraudulent deed had been buried in legal history, I sat on the porch of the old ranch house, same spot I used to sit during those dark, early days, when everything felt like it was slipping through my fingers. Only this time, there was no fire in my chest, just warmth, the soft kind, the kind that comes when you realize you didn't just survive something, you built something from it. A car drove by slow on the gravel road. Windows down, a kid waved from the back seat. The father gave me a nod, and I nodded back, because I knew deep down we hadn't just taken back a ranch. We'd redrawn a map. And this time, it wasn't built on fear or profit. It was built on memory. And memory, that's a power no HOA ever truly understands. There's a strange kind of silence that comes after a fight ends. Not peace, exactly, but an echo, the absence of shouting. The stillness where chaos used to live. Freedom Fields had found that silence, and we were learning to live in it. But the thing about echoes is they can carry voices from the past. And some of those voices weren't finished yet. It started with a petition, folded neatly into my mailbox with no return address, printed on crisp white paper, formal as a wedding invite. Except the message wasn't about union, it was about division. A group of 5 homeowners, all relatively new, all of them holdouts who'd reluctantly agreed to the land lease agreements, had submitted a formal request to reinstate standardized regulations for neighborhood appearance and property maintenance. In other words, a miniature HOA. I read the words 3 times, then set it down. I didn't slam my fist, didn't curse, didn't even sigh. I just stared out the kitchen window toward the southern lot, where an older couple was planting wildflowers next to their bright red mailbox. The same mailbox Karen Mitchell once cited as non-compliant with the palate of the community. They smiled. She knelt in the dirt. He poured her a thermos of iced tea. That, right there, was why I fought. And yet here it was again, a seat of control disguised as order. I could have shut it down immediately. I had every legal right to reject the proposal. We'd written the new Charter of Freedom Fields to make sure nothing like Willow Bend's rulebook could rise from the ashes. But if I'd learned anything during this whole damn war, it's that power doesn't just corrupt from above, it attempts from within. So instead of rejecting it, I invited them to the barn, Tuesday night, 7 p.m., no lawyers, no paperwork, just a circle of chairs, a pot of strong coffee, and every neighbor who wanted to listen. They came, all 5 of them, suits too stiff for summer, not a speck of dirt on their shoes. The leader, a man named Blake, cleared his throat like he was about to give a TED Talk instead of talk to farmers. He said he appreciated the freedom of the land, but felt a lack of structure was undermining property value. He cited examples: overgrown grass, unapproved paint colors, a chicken coop that attracted noise. I let him speak, and when he finished, I stood, didn't raise my voice. Just told a story. I told them about Teresa James, the widow who lost her home because she couldn't afford to repaint her porch after a storm, about Mr. Collins, whose goat pen was bulldozed while he was at the VA hospital, about the night I sat with foreclosure papers on my lap, wondering if I'd have to sell my grandfather's rifle just to buy back a plot of land that should have never been taken. Then I pointed to the door. And if any of you, I said quietly, think the color of a front door matters more than the people who walk through it, you're welcome to leave. No one moved. Blake said nothing. And just like that, the petition was dead. But it wasn't just about Blake. It was about what we did next. Because it wasn't enough to reject the old system. We had to build something better in its place, something stronger, not enforced, embraced. So we started the Freedom Fields Forum, not a council, not a committee, a conversation. Every second Thursday of the month, we opened the barn doors, set out food, and invited anyone with an idea to speak, not to regulate, but to collaborate. And what started as a circle of chairs turned into a ripple of change that rewrote the future of the town one neighbor at a time. One man proposed a shared equipment library: mowers, tools, ladders, so folks didn't have to spend money on stuff they only needed once a season. Approved. Built in 2 weeks. A single mom asked if we could convert the old HOA office lot, now just a grassy rectangle near the cul-de-sac, into a community garden. Within a month, we had rows of vegetables, fruit trees, and a shaded space for kids to dig in the dirt. Some of them had never touched real soil before. A teenager pitched the idea of starting a Freedom newspaper, a printed weekly of local stories, jokes, classifieds, and poems. We named it the Dandelion Press. Printed on recycled paper, funded by donations, delivered by bike. No rules forced these things into being. No fines threatened their absence. They happened because people wanted them to. And that was the magic Karen never understood. You don't build community by forcing conformity. You build it by letting people breathe. That summer was the first real summer we'd had in years. No HOA notices, no surprise dues, no lawsuits, just life, unfiltered. I watched a father and son paint a mural on their garage: a mountain, a sky, a soaring hawk. I saw porch swings go up again, real ones, made of wood and rope and memory. There was a girl who played violin every Friday evening under the old sycamore tree. And people would bring lawn chairs just to listen. Some things we never could have done under the HOA, not without a dozen forms and a threat of removal for violating noise regulations or visual standards. But here it was encouraged. The land, I noticed, responded in kind. The wild grass along the trails grew thicker. The creek ran clearer. A family of foxes made a den near the old windmill. The ranch animals were calmer, the soil richer, the fences more solid, even though no one was inspecting them. And for the first time in what felt like a century, The word freedom wasn't just a slogan. It was felt. But the past doesn't vanish. It waits. And one afternoon, while clearing out the last of the storage sheds by the north gate, I found something. Tucked behind a rusted filing cabinet, buried under HOA signage and yellowing forms, was an old plank. Broken. Scorched. The top half of the Willow Bend sign. All that was left of it. I stared at it for a long time. Thought about burning it. Thought about tossing it into the fire pit out back and watching it crumble. But I didn't. Instead, I carved a single word into the back of the board with my jackknife. Remember. Then I mounted it, face down, inside the tool shed, not for tourists, not for residents, for me, so I'd never forget where we came from and why we could never go back. The next evening, I hosted a small gathering on the ridge. No speeches, no agenda, just a fire, a sky full of stars, and the people who made this place what it had become. Old friends, new neighbors, kids catching fireflies, dogs chasing sticks, laughter that didn't sound cautious anymore. I raised my cup to the land. I said, they echoed it back. And for a moment, it felt like even the hills leaned in to listen. Not to me, to us, because this was no longer my story. It was ours. And together, we were writing the kind of chapter no HOA rulebook could ever erase. The final chapter didn't arrive without a bang. There were no courtrooms left to enter, no boardrooms left to storm, no eviction notices or petitions or articles buzzing with scandal. Instead, it came slowly, like the last ember light of dusk sinking behind the hills. The kind of ending you almost miss because it feels too much like life, just continuing. And that's exactly what made it so powerful. Freedom Fields had passed the threshold from rebellion to rhythm. What was once a town torn between control and chaos had settled into a quiet, confident hum, not perfect, not polished, but real. Our victories no longer made headlines, they grew in gardens, echoed in the clack of hammers on a new neighbor's porch, or whispered from wind chimes hung without permission. The land had changed, not just in law, but in spirit. And yet, there was one last thing I needed to do, not for legal closure, for legacy. I found the sign early one morning while clearing out the last untouched shed near the old HOA clubhouse. The building had been turned into a makerspace woodshop, art corner, small library, and we were renovating the surrounding trail into a butterfly garden. It was supposed to be the final stage of our community renewal project, but tucked behind a rotted plywood sheet, beneath a pile of crumbling brochures and expired parking violation tickets, it waited. The original Willow Bend HOA office sign, the one that had hung like a badge of power for over a decade, heavy, metallic, etched in chrome letters that had once told everyone you are being watched. I stood there for a moment, just me and that sign, the early morning sun slanting through the broken slats of the shed wall, and I felt it again, that strange echo of the past, not grief, not rage, but something deeper, something older, memory. This was the last ghost. I took it home, set it on my sawhorses, and stared. It was scratched, bent, burned on one end edge from where we'd torched the old records room. A scar, like the ones we carry on skin and soul after a long battle. I didn't clean it. I didn't restore it. Instead, I picked up a blowtorch and burned the lettering off, slowly, deliberately, not with hatred, but with mercy, because even bad history deserves the dignity of acknowledgement before it's rewritten. Then I pulled out a fresh can of black paint. No fancy stencils, just a thick bristle brush, and a hand that had guided fence posts, swung hammers, and signed legal victories on courthouse steps. Across that scorched old steel, I painted "Welcome to Freedom Fields," no HOA, no exceptions. It dried under the sun while I brewed coffee, and I could have sworn I heard my grandfather chuckling in the wind like he had all those years ago whenever I misnailed a board and blamed the hammer. That afternoon, I took the sign to the entrance of the main road, the one where Karen Mitchell once had surveillance cameras hidden in fake rocks, the one where developers planned to install an electronic gate and restrict entry to residents and approved guests only. I dug 2 holes, deep ones, the kind that hold more than just wood, they hold meaning. I set the sign between them, leveled it with a string line, and poured the concrete myself. Slow, intentional, no shortcut. Just like everything that had gotten us here, by the time the sun began to set, the new sign stood firm, the sky blazing orange behind it like the land itself was raising a glass. Neighbors began showing up as word spread. Some brought folding chairs. Others just leaned against their trucks. There were kids with juice boxes and dusty boots, retirees holding hands, and teenagers who'd spent the summer building bike trails through the old greenbelt. No speeches were planned, but people started talking anyway, not about what had been lost, but about what had been found. One woman shared how her mother, who'd once been fined for installing a wheelchair ramp without HOA approval, now came out to garden every morning. A man who used to dread opening his mailbox described the joy of receiving letters again, real ones. From friends, not threats. And Kayla, the little girl who'd started the animal shelter in a tool shed, walked up with a rescued dog on a leash and said, "We named him Dusty because he came from the land." Like all of us. I couldn't have written a better ending if I tried. But endings, I've learned, aren't always the end. They're just rests between songs. After the crowd drifted home, I stayed by the sign a while longer. The breeze was soft, the ground beneath me solid, the stars just beginning to poke through the purple blue sky. I looked out across the fields, the real ones, not the fake turf that used to cover the walking paths. You could see everything from that ridge, the lights from the homes glowing warm, not regulated, the silhouettes of barns and sheds built by hands, not committees, the open roads without gates, without guards, just welcome. It was never about erasing order. It was about restoring ownership not just of land, but of life. No one would fine a kid for hanging wind chimes here. No one would issue a citation for planting sunflowers. No one would demand that your American flag be reapproved for symmetry because no one had that power anymore. Not here, not again. Later that week, I was invited to speak at a land stewardship conference up north. I almost said no. I wasn't a speaker. I was a rancher who happened to win a war. But Jenny convinced me, you didn't just protect land. She said, you redefined community. That's worth sharing. So I went, and I told them the truth. Not just the legal battles, not just the court victories. I told them about coffee on the porch, about handshakes between strangers, about wildflowers growing where HOA mulch used to choke the dirt, about a place where people didn't need permission to live. Afterward, a young man came up to me. He said he was about to lose his grandfather's land to a zoning loophole. He didn't know what to do. No one in his town seemed to care. I gave him my number. Told him he had more power than he thought. That land remembers. And when people remember too, they win. He looked me dead in the eye and said, I'm gonna fight like you did. I smiled. No. I said, you're going to fight like you do, but you won't be alone. Back at Freedom Fields. Life continued. Seasons turned. Kids grew. The soil got richer. We planted more trees. Not because of a regulation, but because shade matters. We celebrated first harvests, birthdays, anniversaries, even the day the HOA was dissolved. We call it Founders Day now, the day Freedom Fields remembered itself every year. On that day, we gather by the sign, and we read names, not of enemies, but of builders, the ones who stayed, the ones who spoke up, the ones who knew that land isn't just acreage, it's ancestry, its purpose, its memory. And as the last name is read, someone, usually Kayla, rings an old brass bell we salvaged from the wreckage of the HOA office. One clear note, rising like a promise, that this place is free and always will be.